So, well, we'll jump into this. My name's Ashley. I've been with Sony for, oh man, it's probably been a good, going on 4 years now that I've been with Sony. I've been shooting Sony since about 2013. So I've been using the product for quite a long time. I've photographed quite a bit of stuff throughout all my years of photography. I've done a lot of wedding and portrait work, did some pet photography for a while. I love landscape and, you know, architecture, cityscape, stuff like that. So travel, I love photographing travel, wildlife, and I shoot a lot for zoos as well. So a lot, as you can see, the Instagram title there is zootographer. And if you ever look at that, you'll see that there's a lot of zoo photography there as well. So we'll get started here. Whoops. There we go. So big question is, why is composition important? And it's the easiest thing you can do in terms of your photography skills. The hardest and easiest. The one thing that you can improve without paying any money that will drastically improve the quality of your photos and keep people engaged and looking at your photos. So everything that's in your image is going to do one of two things, right? It's either going to improve the photo, it's going to add to that photo, or it's going to distract and ruin the photo. So we have to make a very conscious effort when we're making photos of what we're choosing to include in the image. The main reason that I point this out is because we currently live in an era of photo bombers, like my brother here, who likes to do this every time I'm taking a photo. If he can, he'll sneak in, make stupid faces, ruin photos. My mom loves it. But when we look at something like this, I wouldn't say this is so much a great photo. This is really a snapshot, right? There's a lot of distractions here. We've got this stuff in the background. We've, of course, got him over here. So there's a lot of things that are basically making this image less attractive, less appealing. So we tend to get kind of these blinders on when we start shooting, when we're in the moment taking photos. And we get so enthralled with the subject, we're looking at just the subject, we stop paying attention to what's in my background, what's in the borders of the frame. So when we look at an image like this, and this is me being the exact same thing, right? I saw the duck, the little island, the reflection. I got drawn in right away, started snapping photos. It wasn't until I started walking away and kind of reviewing that I noticed a lot of things in the photo that were not helping me. And that is, I've got, there we go. I've got distractions here. I've got distractions here. And again, they're minor, but they're there. They're drawing away from the photo. So the easy thing that everyone always says is, oh, you can just Photoshop that out. Well, I'd prefer to get it right in the camera personally. That way I don't need to go in and spend extra time on the computer, as most of us probably right now have more than enough time we can spend on the computer. If I can just get it right in the camera, that's ideal for me. So because it was a nice day and the duck hadn't moved, the easiest correction for me was just to come around to the other side and shoot them. I didn't have any of those same foreground obstructions. It was pretty open on the other side. It was the middle of the day, so the light was up high above, so it was kind of that same flat light. But I got rid of those obtrusions or obstructions. A lot of times we get stuff like this. Again, you get kind of so focused in on the main subject that I've got this other guy in the background, which isn't a terrible distraction, but it's a distraction nonetheless. Probably more so here because it's actually a brighter subject. So anything that's bright is going to pull our eye. And so it is pulling my eye away from the subject as well. So the easiest thing is just to change my frame, right? Off to the left, I didn't have any of those obstructions. So just recomposing, pushing my subject off to the left or off to the right, cleared that all up for me. And this is something too that, depending what medium I'm looking to share this on, if this is just going to go on to Instagram, a lot of times it's going to be in more of a square format anyway. So I could just creatively crop after the fact as well. All right, so this is where I'll open it up to chat. What's the big distraction in this photo? It's not the kid. Yeah, there we go, the ceiling. All this junk up here in the ceiling, right? So again, the easy fix is just to change my perspective. So for me, getting lower, I can keep it so it's just the hay bales. What we ended up doing, because they had a little hay maze and then they had kind of a little hay area. So the easiest thing was just to get them to, and that's his brother. So one kid is cute, two kids are cuter. So throw them both in there, let them wrestle around in the hay and shoot it that way instead. But if I can change my perspective so that the top of these hay bales is the top of my frame, that makes it all better. That gets rid of that whole terrible ceiling that we have in that frame. I would say more times than not, this is something I see though. And this is, you'll see this all the time when people are photographing family and friends, or if it's wildlife stuff, we get so drawn into the subject that we don't see these pieces that are just running right through the subject's head, right? So you'll see this like light posts sticking out of people's head or tree branches sticking out of people's head. And again, for me, the easiest way to correct this was to change my perspective. So instead of me kind of standing or being slightly hunched, I just knelt down. So I got much lower with my subject. And now that same obstruction is up way, way up at the top of the frame. So it's no longer an intrusion in that frame. It's not detracting from the subject. So this also brings us to the point of orientation. A lot of the subjects will be better when photographed a specific direction. So like the tree here worked out better to be shot horizontal. Whereas my landscape worked way better to be shot horizontal, or I'm sorry, vertical on the left here. My tree was better vertical. My landscape was better horizontal. If I shot my landscape vertical, I'm going to start losing a lot of the details that are there and a lot of the compelling parts of that image. And same with my tree on the left. If I shoot it horizontal, it may still work, but in that scene, there was a lot of added kind of negativity in that frame, things that are going to take away from that image. So another example here. So if we shoot the same subject, which do you guys prefer? Left side or horizontal, or right side and vertical?
Left.
Left. We got a lot of lefts, a lot of rights. See, so this is also another thing. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? So I also have to know who I'm shooting for. In this case, it works as a great teaching aid because we have both options. So I've got a left side one, which shows kind of the great scale of all of these casks of wine. And then the right side, if I'm shooting for like a magazine or something like that, works perfectly in that frame as well. So knowing your subject, knowing which way they're facing, things like that is the biggest thing. A lot of things will have a better working orientation. Yeah, you're right. A little bit more depth of field here would also aid. But some things have a more ideal orientation, and you'll usually see it in the frame right away. If you're getting to the point where if I'm shooting horizontal, and like if it's an animal, and their feet and their head are at the top and bottom of my frame, it's possible that it'll work better shooting it vertical, give them more room to work within that frame as well. All right, have we all heard of rule of thirds? I would say it's probably the most common, probably the most basic and most used rule of composition that's out there. Since we've all heard of it, we'll go over this a little quicker. But basically, we're going to want to look at our frame that we're recording and split it up into thirds. Ideally, we want our subjects to be on one of those third lines. And my main point of interest, I would really like to be at that intersection line. So in this case, we've got our two birds. The main bird up front is basically right in the crosshairs of where those two lines intersect. This picture works really well on here because you can see both birds are pretty close to each side of that thirds line. But having both of them there, for the viewer, your eye kind of does this ping pong piece where it bounces back and forth, but it doesn't really leave the frame. If I only have one subject, and I warned you guys, I shoot a lot of stuff at zoos, so you're going to see some zoo photos. But again, rule of thirds, stacking my character here off to the left. And this one, I chose to actually shoot it more so in this regard because A, the animal's facing off to the right of the frame. So I want to give them frame to face into. But also all that flat kind of nothing, just that bokeh on the right, works really well for the zoo in this case. They've used this image many, many times for different advertisement pieces, different social media campaigns, and they can drop in all kinds of text or advertisement on that right side. So again, a nice rule of thirds option. This one worked out really well just because my subject happened to intersect on both of those intersecting pieces. So the two key parts of the story. This was actually a fun event. Truth be told, my wife is a zookeeper. And so this worked out really well. I get a note from her in the morning saying, hey, I built a snowman in the tiger exhibit if you want to come photograph it this morning when we open up. So of course I had to be there. The funny thing is that the two tigers came out, saw the snowman, and instantly demolished it. So, and on many of the cameras, so we'll touch on landscape here too, but real quick, since I've got this somewhat handy, well, let's do this here. I'm going to show you guys camera here real quick. So for sure on the Sony cameras, it's probably available on a lot of your guys' other cameras as well. This is on an A6400 at the moment, but I can actually enable, and I'm going to go over until I get to the display options here. And you can see I have an option called grid lines. Within here, I can actually turn on a rule of thirds grid. And then as I have my camera, oh, it's not going to display it, unfortunately, on there. You'll have to believe me, it's there. But then you'll have a rule of thirds grid that actually shows up on the back screen and shows up in the viewfinder for you. So it makes it really easy to do that rule of thirds piece in camera without having to kind of guess as to where you need to put your subjects. If your camera doesn't have the ability to put that rule of thirds overlay, I would say shoot the scene a little wider than what you need. And then that way you can crop it after the fact and have it fit that rule of thirds. All right. So with landscapes, the idea with rule of thirds is I want to not stack my horizon straight down the middle of the frame. So I either want that horizon to follow, whoops, I was going to say, I thought this had a little thing for me, but on here we have our horizon more towards that top third. And the main reason is that my landscape is really the subject of the photo here. The sky was pretty, but that landscape was a lot prettier. So I'm going to give the majority or 2/3 of that frame to the landscape. On my next shot, the sky was super pretty and the water was, it wasn't, you know, flat, glassy water that's reflective. It was pretty choppy water, so it was pretty boring. But the sunrise was super, super pretty. So in this frame, we wanted to give all of that room to the sky and let that be my subject. The sun, or kind of that focal point, is also right in the middle for me. So we want to put that on one of our intersecting thirds. Again, draw your interest there. The other thing too, as we remember, bright objects in the frame are going to draw people's eye. So if I have the sun and I stacked it all the way over to the left side of the screen here, it's going to start pulling the viewer out of the frame. So I want to make sure I keep that at a focal point there. Is the rule of thirds overlay in camera? Is that the question? Oh yeah, so everything you're seeing here is in camera. Yep, I don't have a whole lot of time to sit and edit a lot anymore. So almost all of this is shot mirrorless. So this is shot on a mirrorless camera. And if anything, it's maybe some slight touch up in, I'm gonna blank on the name, but a lot of these are shot as a JPEG and transferred over to my phone. And then I just do maybe some minor touch ups in Snapseed. Yep, so let's go back. So this is out of the camera. This one I did use a filter though, and it was kind of a flat day as much as that can be. But this, I actually had a variable ND filter on the camera. So that one kind of gradually goes from dark to clear. And I had that on the front of the lens. So the dark up on the sky, the clear part on the landscape. And this was on a fishing trip. So this was shot from the boat and just had to be as good as we could get it there. I didn't want to bring the whole bag full of camera equipment onto the boat, so. All right, so we'll talk about framing. So a lot of times we'll get into a situation where we maybe have some obstructions or maybe the environment isn't that great. We can use things in the frame. So in this case, these two trees to kind of lock the viewer's eye on that subject. So we give them kind of a hard stop so they don't venture beyond those pieces. So I'm going to ask the question, and I usually get the same answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you guys think the blurry color stuff is in the front? The orangey stuff on the bottom, the yellow stuff on the top? Got balloons, we got lens flare. I'm starting to catch up. Not this time, not this time. Some flowers. So it's not lens flare. And this is the first time nobody has said my finger, which is usually the comment I get. But it's actually just two leaves that were on the ground. So this is in the middle of fall. All the leaves have kind of fallen off the trees, so the trees are pretty blah. You can kind of see, if you look on that far right, everything's kind of like a flat gray kind of color that day. So I just picked up an orange leaf and a yellow leaf and held them about an inch or so in front of the lens. And because I'm focusing so far beyond those pieces, they just are a nice little pop of color. So a nice, easy way to, again, kind of build a little bit of a wall, build a little color into what's normally kind of a flat picture otherwise. Oops, there we go. So again, just framing, using what we have to kind of build a frame around the subject. Have any of you guys shot steel wool? Or played with steel wool? So it's kind of a very cool effect. So this looks very violent in this photo, right? It looks like there's a massive fire going on right behind him. This is actually probably about a 20-second exposure, I want to say. So what you do is you get a little bit of steel wool, get like a whisk, pack all the steel wool into the whisk, hook that onto like a rope or a chain or something like that, and then you'll light the steel wool on fire. And as you spin it around, all of these little pieces will go kind of meteoriting off of it. So it creates kind of a very cool look. Very easy DIY photography for you. So a lot of times our framing doesn't have to be a solid wall either. A lot of times we can use elements in the photo that will work as a frame. So in here we're using kind of that crowd of people. And that keeps your eye drawn on the couple. You do venture into the crowd, looking at the sparklers, things like that, but it does create a wall effect around them. Leading lines is another fun one. This is where we start getting into where I really have to build my photo before I take it. So I have to look for what can be compelling. So this is also kind of rule of thirds, right? Because we stacked our fisherman here off to the left. But we have these lines that kind of draw your eye to him as well. Similar idea. This one was a little bit more Photoshop. Again, this is one of those gross, like springtime kind of photos where there's still snow, but everything's just muddy and gray and flat. So keeping the pop of color from her clothes is our attention grabber. And sometimes we don't have aspects that are gonna really help. So filling the frame with the subject works really well as also. So in this case, I mean, that peacock feather is something that can easily just draw your attention. The peacock itself, not really the focal point though here. It's really that, all that plumage, all that feather. Same thing here. The subject that I was photographing was in an exhibit that looked very much like a zoo exhibit. Didn't want that for my photo. So instead I got as close as I could, filled the frame up as much as I could with my subject. The other thing we can look for is going to be patterns and repetition. So a lot of these you can practice if you just go for a walk with the camera. Kind of look for these different pieces, photograph them. But we have a lot of different repeating patterns here, right? Got those guys, got all of those patterns. The other thing that works really well in some of this is if we have something that breaks up that pattern. So we've got some of this vinage that's disrupting the pattern a little bit too. And same concept with kind of that repeating pattern. And a lot of these repeating patterns work best if we have them in odds. So 3s, 5s, things like that. It just gives more balance to that as well. If we have evens, sometimes it doesn't really work out as well. It's not as appealing, but having an odd number balances it a little bit more. So again, his head, the humps, all kind of work together as one kind of repeating piece here. Cool. So we'll do this here. So that's kind of what I've got for you guys on some of the composition. It's just kind of a quick run through. What we can do is open it up. If you guys have any questions, even if you have stuff not related to composition at all, if you have questions on cameras and stuff like that, I can help you out and answer what I can there as well. Otherwise, if you're, feel free to enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah, thank you for joining. Thanks, Brian. I see your questions, Jennifer. So what exactly do you have a question about in terms of frame rate? Oh, thanks, Marilyn. Sometimes, Cheryl, you can't make a landscape super interesting. A lot of times you're going to almost have to find something that you can work into it or try and make work well with it. So if there's a good landscape feature, you know, whether it be rocks or, you know, whatever that happens to be. But sometimes it's just kind of a flat image. If that's the case, I try and focus on if there's a incredibly good sky, if we have good poofy clouds or a great reflection on water, and I try and let that be the main focus for that. And sometimes it's just not, it looks better to you than it is ever going to look on the camera. That does happen as well. Oh, sure, Jennifer. So when you're looking at those record settings, that first number is going to be how many frames per second is being recorded in the video. So that'll go 24, 30, 60, 120. If you think about it in the sense of when you watch a movie at the theater, 24 frame is typically cinema. A lot of high-speed action kind of stuff that you're seeing is a lot of times shot in 60 or 120 frame. And the reason they do that is because you have so many more frames, it's a lot easier to slow it down. So some of this is going to be dependent on what you want to shoot. If I'm going to shoot sports and action, 60 or 120 frames is nice because it gives me the opportunity to move that footage into slow motion. If I'm just going to be shooting like a talking head YouTube video, I'll probably shoot it at like 30p. That second number that you're seeing, the 50M on your example, is the bit rate of the file. So think of it just basically kind of like megapixels in your picture. The higher that bit rate is, the more information you have to work with in that video file. Hey, Keith. So yeah, depth of field when you're composing your image, a lot of times this is going to depend on the subject as well. So depth of field's a big piece here. So like we'll look at my camel here, for example. The background's not really appealing at all on this photo. So I'm using a really shallow depth of field to hide that background. If I had a really pretty landscape, let's say, whoops, wrong tab here. Let's go, use this for example. There we go. So if I have a really pretty landscape like this, I do want more of a greater depth of field so that I can include more in that frame as well. So a lot of when I choose depth of field in terms of composition, it's if there's elements I can't hide from there, I will use a shallower depth of field so that they blur out, they're less noticeable, they don't distract. So Randy, what are my thoughts on using more or less depth of field for that shot? For that camel shot, let's do this here. So for this shot, I could use more depth of field and keep him probably more in focus. Again, the downside is that more of this background is going to start to come in focus as well, which wasn't really adding anything to the image. And at the time, my main focus was really his face and his goofy hair. So keeping that as the sharpest piece in that 3 also keeps your view more on his face. And Jennifer, so XAVCS, so you've got, I'm gonna just switch real quick here so you can see. Advanced, let's go to this. All right, so you've got basically 3 options, if you will. XAVCS is more of a proprietary file format in video, but it's going to be more robust than AVC HD. So you're going to have more information captured there. Your difference between 4K and HD is just resolution. 4K is going to have much greater resolution to it, about 4 times the resolution. Problem is that those files are going to be really, really big. So it's going to be much heavier workload on the computer if you're editing video. And when we go into 4K, it's also going to limit what frame rates I have available to me. If I shoot in HD, so XAVCS HD, I actually have tons of options for frame rates and file depth. The difference just being that it's going to be 1080 by 1920 as opposed to 4K capability. And how do you account for aspect ratio when you compose? So a lot of times in my head, I've always kind of got the idea that I'm shooting in the same 3:2 ratio. And so if I'm shooting it wider, let's see if I've got an example here that I can show you. Let's go back to, let's see real quick. Let's go in here. I'm just going to find an image that I shot wider than the frame. Oh, you know what? I got it. So something like this is a lot of times the example I'll use for shooting it wider than you need. And so for this, I didn't know exactly how it was going to be used at the time. So again, shooting it wider, A, because he was moving, so I needed to allow more room for them to move in the frame. But this also gave me the options for shooting it or delivering it as a vertical, or being able to deliver it as even a tighter cropped horizontal. So I was shooting probably twice as much space as what I actually needed, just so that I had flexibility to crop it after the fact. So a lot of times if I'm shooting wildlife and I'm up closer where they are a larger piece of that frame, I'm probably shooting with enough leeway in that frame that I can make up for it cropping. The reality is most of the common or most of the current cameras, you have more than enough resolution that you can crop probably half of that frame and still have a very usable file. So keep that in mind too, that even though you might only have like 20 or 24 megapixel, you still have quite a bit of resolution that you can crop with. So the A6400 autofocus, there's a whole class on that actually. So we'll probably end up at some point doing some camera specific classes too, to jump into that. but in terms of autofocus modes, you have a lot of options there. Let me see here. So if we go in here, so just as a real quick, the main thing will be, realistically, you'll have AFC, AFS are the two main types of autofocus. So single, it'll refocus every time I press halfway down on the button. It won't refocus till I lift up and press halfway down again. Continuous autofocus will keep refocusing as long as I'm holding down on the shutter button. And then you have direct manual focus, which is AFS, but as long as I'm holding halfway down, I can override manual focus. And then in terms of area, what you're probably seeing is just where the camera is going to look to focus. So wide will be everything, and then as we start going down the list, it's going to start limiting that area it's looking to a smaller and smaller area. The very bottom option will be tracking, and this is actually only going to work if I'm in AFC. So I have to be in one of the more manual modes, so program, aperture, shutter, or manual, to have access to these. And once I'm in there, and I'm in AFC, then I can go into tracking, and I can use any of those other existing autofocus areas. And when it grabs focus, it'll actually hold focus and follow throughout the frame on them as well. So hyperfocal distance. So it's a harder thing to do in any of the more current cameras. A lot of times you saw it more in like some of the rangefinders and things like that, where they would tell you if you were at a specific aperture, you could basically be between X, and everything in that range would be in focus. You don't really see a means on a lot of the current cameras to gauge that though. Brian, I don't really shoot video with the intent of pulling a still necessarily. A lot of that comes down to when we talked about those frame rates in the video. If I'm shooting in HD, my resolution that I have is significantly smaller than just shooting a still photo. And if I shoot in 4K, if I pull a still out of that, it's only going to be about an 8 megapixel image. So it's actually a pretty small resolution out of it. The other downside is I'm limited to a 24 or 30 frame per second video, meaning that my shutter speed is probably only going to be between like 1/50th or 1/60th of a second. So my shutter speeds also might be way too slow to get a sharp image as well. So for a lot of wildlife, I'm still shooting stills with the tracking autofocus. And most of the Sony cameras, almost all of them can shoot between, on the current stuff, around 10 to 20 frames a second. So you can get a pretty good burst of photos out of it as well. And so we had a question too on, just real quick, whoops, I goofed it up again. Let's go back to this. There we go. So I'm going to switch PowerPoints here real quick. So we had a question on the peacock photo just for settings. So this image, and a lot of times what you'll run into is if I haven't switched my autofocus area on the camera. So real quick here. So we'll just make this big so you guys can see that. So on my camera, if I haven't switched my autofocus area, so it's set to wide, a lot of times it's going to default to the closest subject. which may or may not be what I want to focus on. So if you hit that function button on the back of your camera, it'll pop up that little shortcut menu. So in here, if I go into the focus area option, and on the side here, I'm just going to move my window out of the way so I can see a little better. If I'm set to wide, it's going to look at everything, every focus point in the camera and put priority on the closest subject to me. When I go to zone, it's a smaller area focus. When I go to center, it's just the center of the frame. But ideally, if I use something like flexible spot or even tracking in a small flexible spot, I now have this little target that I can move around. So I can put this on my subject, and then as I'm holding halfway down, it'll focus there. I can recompose in the frame the way I want. So a lot of times I use that tracking autofocus for that. So in those options, you'll see if I toggle to the right, it'll actually go with more options. It's basically just how big that flexible spot's going to be. So right now it's set to small, medium, large. If I go to large, it's just a bigger target. If I go to, whoops. Versus, so small, medium, it's a little bigger. Large, it's a whole lot bigger. So just depends how big of a target I want. A lot of times with wildlife, I'll leave it at small, just so it's a much finer point to hit with. So Jennifer, for your question, so you're photographing moving subjects, not able to be behind the camera necessarily. So on that, you're probably going to be best, and you have a Sony camera, Jennifer, or what kind of camera do you have? A6400. So on yours, I would probably, for video, I'd leave it at AFC, and I'd set that focus area to be wide. So are you shooting sports, things of that nature? Is that what this is? Oh, so yeah, so I'd leave it at wide and keep it on AFC. And then as long as you also have like your face detection pieces turned on. So let's go to our autofocus. So you'll want to turn on pre-AF. It's probably already turned on. And then as long as you have like face detection and eye stuff turned on, it'll actually default on your face then and focus on your face for you. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up here. I know the camera company will be having some other classes, and we'll probably try and set up something where we're going like once a week. So we'll have a different topic every week. Feel free to come back and join every week. Likewise, if you have questions, we'll do a little Q&A session like this at the end of every class. So if you have other questions that you run into throughout the week, feel free to come back and ask at the end. Thanks for joining, guys.